L'kuta Sichis Chelek Chof Hei Vayishlach Aleph Leili Nishmas Rabbi Yosef Binyamin Ben Rabbi Menashe Kaltman. What happens when we go on a mission that is dangerous or that can affect us negatively? This very Gishmak Sicha teaches us that we have nothing to worry about. It says that Yaakov came whole to the city of Shechem. Chazal tell us, and Rashi brings us up in Bifrush al Torah, Rashi brings us as well, as Shalom meant, Shalom begufay, Shalom b'mamonay, Shalom b'teirasay. He was complete, he was fully healthy, he was complete, he had all of his money, and he was complete, he had all of his Torah. The first two details, the fact that he is whole in body and whole in his finances, is natik, is necessary. As the Medrash explains, because earlier he had a fight with the Malach of Esav, and the Malach had hit him in the Gid Hanasha area, and because of that he was limping. So you have to be told that by the time he came to Shechem, that limp had healed. Shalom b'mamoynoi. Even though Yaakov continued to pay off, to gift Esav, the gift that he gave him for 9 years, which was clearly a huge financial expense. Nevertheless, when he came to Shechem, he was still not lacking any money. Rashi says something similar to the Medrash, that he was Shalom Begufay, he was healed from his limp. He didn't lose anything because of that gift that he gave to Esav. So then there's the third detail that was brought in the Gemara and is brought in Rashi, that he was Shalom b'teirasei, he was complete, he was whole with regards to his Torah. The Medrash doesn't specify in what regard this is talking about. Like, for example, by Shalom b'gufay, the Medrash said, referring to the limp that he got from the Sarei Shal Esav. But what was Shalom b'teirasei? The Medrash says nothing. What about Rashi? In Pirush Rashi, Gefim and Demastira, we actually find two things that Rashi says that conflict with each other. Rashi on the Gemara in Shabbos says that Yaakov Avinu did not forget his learning despite the hardships of his travel, of his journey. But in Rashi on Chumash here on this parsha, Rashi says that he didn't forget his learning despite the fact that he was in Lavan's house. So right away on this Rashi we have to understand was is der Tam Ashrin zwischen the zwei Pirushim. Why did Rashi change from the Gemara and the Chumash to give two different explanations? That in the Gemara he says that we were worried that he might forget his learning or have a hard time learning while he was traveling, and in the Rashi and Chumash we're saying that we were worried that he would forget his learning while he was in Lavan's house. Nochmer, the question goes a step further. Lechede is ibchem istabra. Bepirusha la tede v'Rashi is mefaras pudus al mikra. Volt masim given to sagen dafke the pirush la shas lo yishachach talmudim b'tetei chaderech und nit beveis Lavan. Not only are we wondering why Rashi says two different explanations, we're also wondering about the placement of them. Seemingly, in Chumash, it would have made more sense, according to Pshat, to say what Rashi said in the Gemara, that Yaakov didn't forget his learning or he was whole in his learning despite his travels. Why is that better in Psut Shel Mikra? The pasuk is saying that when Yaakov came complete to the city of Shechem, was the Psut Shel Mikra kommen, as der Shalom is a chidish in Zusammenhang mit Yaakov's ankommen in Shechem. Since the pasuk is talking about Yaakov's arrival in Shechem, so according to Pshat, the Shalom, the wholeness that the pasuk is talking about, should be associated with Yaakov's arrival in Shechem. Now, before the Rebbe finishes his question, the Rebbe clarifies in the brackets, when did the Shalom happen? Whether it was Gufay, whether it was Mamoynoi, when did it happen? The Rebbe is going to say that in the Medrash, it seemed that it happened very quickly and in a miraculous way, but according to Pshat, it took time. Says the Rebbe in the brackets. Medrash states that Yaakov is Geld given mitzvah losei durch Yisrach leHashemesh. Medrash says that Yaakov was healed immediately from the limp. as the pasuk says that the sun shined upon him, and that the rays of the sun healed him. The Medrash says that the Eibishter replenished what was missing, and immediately returned to him all the money that he spent. And according to that, then he would have already been complete, whole in his body and whole in his money when he arrived to Sukkos, which was 18 months earlier. If you read through Parshas Vayishlach, after Yaakov departs from Esav, or parts ways with Esav, he goes to Sukkos. Then the Gemara, the Gemara explains that it was 18 months between Yaakov's arriving to Sukkos and then Yaakov's arriving to Shechem. So according to the Medrash, the healing and the replenishment of Yaakov's finances took place right when he got to Sukkos, which was 18 months earlier. So then the Rebbe's question about the Beis Lavan would apply to that too, because it has nothing to do with arriving to Shechem. But al derech hapshat, it does alspen and TV. But on a pshat level, there's no reason to learn the way the Medrash learns. Rather, we would understand that it all happened in a natural process. Whether the healing from his limp or the replenishment of his money, it would have happened in a gradual process. And that's what the pasuk is telling us. That by the time he got to Shechem, by then he was whole. Because it took all this time for the healing to take place over his limp, from his limp, and during this time his animals were procreating, and therefore all those animals that he had gifted to Esav were given back to him, where he received them back through the natural process of the sheep growing, of the families of the sheep and the animals growing. So Shalom begufay and Shalom b'mamayno, according to Pshat, took a process, and it was not until he arrived to Shechem that he was completely whole in his money and in his health. So now we go back to Shalom b'teirasei. If you would say, like the Rashi says in the Gemara, that the pasuk is telling us that Yaakov did not lose out on his learning despite the travels, despite the hardships of his travels. So you could say that when Yaakov arrived to Shechem and he settled down in a more permanent manner, as the pasuk says that he actually purchased real estate, that despite the fact that until he got to Shechem, he had a very difficult time traveling, or the travels bring upon him difficulties, but nevertheless, now as he settles down, he's still complete in his Torah. So then the pasuk makes sense what it's telling us. But if you're saying that the pasuk is telling us that he was whole despite the fact that he spent all that time in Lavan's house, then that wholeness is not really associated at all with his arrival to Shechem. These shlemus is by him given by Maveki from Beis Lavan. He already had this wholeness when he left Lavan's house. So why in Chumash, where Rashi is talking pshat level, and we want the pasuk to make sense to say that when he arrived to Shechem, there was a certain wholeness that happened then? Why does Rashi bring in something Beis Lavan that happened some time ago? Now the Rebbe points out, says Nitkein Kasha Vikem Bechlal Zaken as Apirish Shlishach Talmud Bebeis Lavan Be'ester Pasuk Zak Befeirish Vayava Yaakov Shalom in Erst Ankumendik in Ir Shechem. You can't say 1 second if Yaakov's shleimus was, if the pasuk says that his shleimus was in Shechem, how could you bechlal? In other words, even not al pipshat, Even let's say in the Gemara, if the pasuk is saying that he wasn't whole until Shechem, how can you say that this wholeness happened to Beis Lavan? So the Rebbe says that's not a question. In other words, if we weren't coming from a pshat perspective, you can't say that the Beis Lavan and Shechem is a stira. Why? Because the answer would be simple. In pasuk steht doch nit Shalom nor b'teirasai. The pasuk doesn't say that he arrived Shalom b'teirasai to Shechem, nor Shalom stam. The words of the pasuk is Shalom by itself. Kemen sagen gewonnen Akosov, als kumendik in Shechem is Yaakov geworden in ganzen Shalom in alle drei Sachen begufe b'menu b'teirasai. One can say that the b'teirasai lechud the Yaakov is Shalom echfrier. In the pasuk itself, if you weren't limited to pshat, you could say that the pasuk says that Yaakov reached wholeness when he came to Shechem. Why? Because b'teirasei happened much earlier. But since begufay u'b'mamoinoi did not happen till later, till he arrived to Shechem, so the ultimate shalom didn't happen till Shechem. So that's how you could teach the pasuk. That's how you could teach the pasuk the word shalom. That the wholeness of all three together didn't happen until Shechem. But if you're teaching shalom b'teirasei individually, and you're teaching it according to pshat, then to say mipnei teirach haderech is much closer to pshat than bebeis lavan. And therefore the question that the Rebbe has on Rashi is, why does Rashi choose mipnei teirach bebeis lavan in pshuta shel mikra bebeis lavan and not mipnei teirach haderech? The shaila is aber, the Baldman can learn as eich der shalom b'teirasei is verbunden with Yaakov's uncle in Shechem if the teirach haderech. Since there is a way to say that shalom b'teirasei is connected with Yaakov's arrival in Shechem, farvos kleibt us Rashi verbindet es über Brüssel aller Teire darfke mit dem Zman when Yaakov is going to Beis Lavan. Why does Rashi specifically choose to say that Yaakov's shleimus in Teire was despite the fact that he was Beis Lavan? So that is our first question. And the first question of the Sikha is going to be why does Rashi explain al pi pshutei shel mikra that Yaakov's shleimus betalmudei was connected with his time in Lavan's house and not with the Teirach haderech? We have to understand another question. In Medrash brings the chaferte zach in welche Yaakov is ben shalom. The Medrash brings a fourth area in which Yaakov's wholeness was realized. Shalom b'banav. That he was whole in his family, in his children. But I'm hacha shalom b'banav. The pasuk says Yaakov was saying that he was expecting Esav to come and smite some of his children, and therefore he divided them into two camps, so at least one camp should survive. But over here, when he came here, all of his children were whole. They weren't hurt. They weren't hit. They were shalom b'banav. Isn't it move on? L'cheire is eich ad der uftu for shalom b'banav moving on derech pshat. Seemingly, this is also a pshat thing. Nicht nur in Medrash, derech hadrash. In other words, this is it's something that we understand the pashtos. That Yaakov was afraid of losing his children, and when he came to Shechem, he had all of his children. The Medrash says also shalom b'banav. The Gemara says only three things. So why does Rashi go with the Lashna Gemara, which does not mention shalom b'banav, and does mention and instead brings the Gemara, which does not mention shalom b'banav? Are you going to say that be'etzem shalom b'banav happened earlier? Says the Rebbe, dit mir is noch gresser. The question of why Rashi doesn't mention shalom b'banav is even greater, and that's going to answer this question as well. That what about the fact that shalom b'banav mitzad Esav happened earlier? So the Rebbe says like this: in Oni Parshas Lech Lecha vert itself wegen Birchas HaKadosh Baruch Hu zu Avramin v'eschel gadol. In the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha, Hashem tells Avram, "I'm going to make you into a great nation." Is it Rashi Mefarish? Rashi, which is Pshuta Shel Mikra, explains: traveling could cause three things. It minimizes the family size, and it minimizes or it diminishes the financial situation, and it negatively affects a person's popularity. So therefore Avram needs these three brachas. where Hashem promises Avram that he's going to have a lot of children, etc., etc. Despite the fact that when you travel, it affects the ability to procreate. Zetman as a biracha bekesher labanim, then in Yeniki was mevorend, when it says olu zu werden dem hier durch tiltul haderech. So now this teaches us that if someone is traveling, a bracha that it shouldn't affect the ability to have children is a necessary bracha. So when Yaakov arrives to Shechem after traveling for quite some time, and he arrives Shalem, so Rashi should have said that Yaakov came Shalem B'banav, that despite the fact that he was traveling, and traveling normally has an effect on having children. And nevertheless, Yaakov was Shalem B'banav. So this is the Rebbe's second question. Why does Rashi not mention Shalem B'banav, which was mentioned in the Medrash, and would have made a lot of sense according to Pshuto Shel Mikra? In the Pirush Rashi. So to answer these questions, let us first answer a more general question that we have on this Rashi. And once we understand that will lead us to understanding this Rashi a little bit differently, and that ultimately will help us understand, answer our questions. Let us look at the pasuk Vayav Yaakov Shalom Shechem. Nach einer Riches Asipra Yaakov is nicht geworden von Lavan und Esavin, weil gedacht auskommen, als der Iker der Pirush von Vayav Yaakov Shalom is befashtos. We've just learned these stories. Yaakov spent 20 years in Lavan's house, and Lavan tried to cheat him, and Lavan tried to chase him, and Lavan tried to hurt him, etc., etc. And then Yaakov meets with Esav, and Esav was a very dangerous person, and Yaakov was saved from both of them. So we could have translated Yaakov Shalom in the most literal way. And it's angekommen ganz unbeschädigt von Lavan and Esav. That he arrived whole, unharmed by Lavan or by Esav. Rashi allein is gleich mefarish in a Divraskel Achreza. As Rashi says in the next Rashi, Bevoyoy mi Padan Aram, that the pasuk says that Yaakov came from Padan Aram. Ka'adam ha'imel lachavere yatsa pleni ve'shini aroiz b'shalim. And someone might say to someone else, this person was saved from the lion's den, or more literally, from the lion's teeth, and he came out whole. Here the pasuk is saying that Yaakov came whole from Padan Aram, which is where he was encountered Lavan and Esav along the way, and yet, though they wanted to harm him, Yaakov arrived Shalom. That's how it could have been understood in the most literal way. Yaakov Yaakov went through a dangerous time, and yet he came out safe. Aber Rashi sagt Pshuto Shel Mikra, as Vayav Yaakov Shalom is nit shaychus an atzala von der sakanim esad Lavan ve'esav. When Rashi teaches the word Shalom, he doesn't teach it that he's referring to the fact that he was saved from the danger that was lurking from Lavan and from Esav. But rather, says Rashi, it was more a overall wholeness with regards to his health, with regards to his finances, and with regards to his learning Torah. So why does Rashi change? From where in Pshuto Shel Mikra do you see that this is the Shalom? And even in what Rashi brings, the three begufay b'mameni b'teirasei, Rashi doesn't say begufay that he was saved from sakana. He says that he was healed from a limp, which seems to be trivial in comparison to the fact that his entire life and the life of his entire family was in danger. The Rashi in the brackets addresses a point that one might try to answer and refutes it. Men kenit zogin as der hechrich is von dem lashon shalom. You cannot answer that the reason why Rashi goes down this road is because of the word shalom. Von welchen says mashmas frier is given achisoren und nor achisoren und danach is es nicht geworden. The Rebbe says maybe the word shalom, which means whole, implies that there was actually something lacking. And shalom means that whatever was missing was replaced. So, for example, he had a limp, which means he was lacking in his health, or he gave away a gift, so he was lacking in some of his finances, and that was replaced. So maybe that's why Rashi goes down this road, because it wasn't something of just a danger. actually looking for something that he was actually missing, and it was replaced. Says the Rebbe, that cannot be the answer. Weil Neusef lazazin dem Pirush Rashi shel achrei zahanal. Zogt der beferes lashon shalom b'shaychas dat shalom ben shini aroyes. First of all, in the next Rashi uses the term shalom with regards to the fact that he was saved from the lion's den, which wasn't a lack. It wasn't like the lions bit him, and then, metaphorically speaking, and then he was healed. It was just in a place of danger, and he came out. So we already see that shalom could be used even not in a place where something is actually missing. But that's a different Rashi. Is von dem Pirush Rashi gufa bucha chazoi. Even in this Rashi itself, it's clear that shalom doesn't mean that something was actually missing. Varum Rashi sagt doch shalom b'tirasei shel shachach talmudei. Rashi says with regards to the fact that he was whole, with regards to his learning, that he didn't forget his learning. Zetman as afal pi as lepoil is by imke chesaron nit given. It wasn't like he did forget it and he remembered it later. He didn't forget it, which means there was no actual chisaron. Nevertheless, past to zagen der of shalom, you could still use the term shalom mitzad der use for chisaron, because there's a possibility that he could have lost something. He could have forgotten his learning bebeis lavan. Nevertheless, we call it shalom that he didn't. Then we could have used the same thing, that he was in danger. It's true that he didn't lose anything, but he could have lost something, and we could still use the word shalom. So we're back to our question of Sif Gimel. The fact that the word shalom is there is not in any way an indication to a specific type of shalom. Anything that could have happened wrong, that didn't, could still be understood in the term shalom, and therefore, the question is, why does Rashi go into the details of begufay, b'mamoyne, u'b'teirasei, instead of saying most literally and most simply that shalom means that Yaakov was saved from Lavan and from Esav, who wanted to harm him. In Shleimer Abir Bazeh, the Rebbe is going to answer this question in Sif Dalet. The Rebbe is going to say that Yaakov already had a promise from Hashem to protect him. So the fact that Yaakov was saved from Lavan and from Esav is not a chiddush. It can't be that the pasuk is telling us that Hashem fulfilled his promise. Once Hashem gave a bracha, we know that it was done. So if the Torah says Vayava Yaakov Shalom, it must be something on top of the basic safety from the hands of Lavan and Esav, as we'll see inside. As soon as Yaakov leaves Charan, Hashem makes a promise. I am with you. I will protect you in everywhere that you go. Which on the most basic level it means I'm going to protect you from Esav and from Lavan. As Rashi himself says over there in the beginning of Parshas Vayetze, Yaakov was afraid from Esav and from Lavan, so the Eibishter tells him, I'm coming with you, I'm going to watch over you. When Yaakov is angekommen Shalom von Esav and Lavan, and therefore the pasuk doesn't have to emphasize to us that Hashem fulfilled his promise and Yaakov arrived whole, that unharmed by Esav and Lavan. Thus is move on may love. This is self-understood. When the Eibishter says to Yaakov, I'm going to watch over you, it is self-understood that Yaakov comes back shalom in the fact that he was unharmed by Esav and Lavan. That the pasuk doesn't have to tell us. When the Eibishter maftiach when kanal sif beis similar to the case of Avram, when the Eibishter promised him that he should go lech lecha, I will make you into a great nation, as their tiltula derech v'bayim nit b'mayis for the shleisha dvarim. Whereas Rashi explained that the travails of the journey will not affect negatively in any of the three things, in his children, in his money, and in his name. We don't find anywhere where the Torah has to tell us it actually happened, it actually came true, and Avram arrived whole. Because once the Eibishter gave the promise, it's self-understood that promise will be fulfilled. So in that case, why does the pasuk say Yaakov Shalom? This is what's bothering Rashi. Why does the pasuk have to tell us Shalom if we already know that the Eibishter made a promise that it's going to be this way? Learn the Rebbe Rashi, and that's why Rashi learns as the Retzach Nitvegan Shleimazach is Nichlol in Avtachas HaKadosh Baruch Hu V'hini Anech Imachos Marticha. That the Shalim that it says here in Parshas Vayishlach does not refer to a wholeness that was already addressed, that was already promised by Hashem to Yaakov earlier on. V'hini Anech Imach Ush Marticha. Nor Vegin Murois Miyuchados. It must be referring to certain specific events that could have caused a lack of shalom in Yaakov. Despite the fact that Hashem already made the promise to Yaakov, there could have been certain things that happened along the way that would have affected Yaakov negatively. Nevertheless, Yaakov was whole. So Rashi is saying there must be certain things that were not included in Hashem's bracha, and because of that, they could have happened despite the bracha of Hashem. And those are the things that the pasuk is telling us that despite that, Yaakov was shalom. Und derfum was the pasuk sagt shalom stam is muchach. Das ist given nicht nur in ein prat, nur shalom kipsut in alle seine pratim. And since the pasuk doesn't specify the details, just says shalom, so it's very clear to Rashi that it means shalom in all of his aspects. And therefore Rashi lists specifically these three things, as the Rebbe will explain. In other words, now the Rebbe has to explain to us what does it mean? What are these things that could have been problematic for Yaakov, despite the fact that Yaakov already has a bracha from Hashem, and therefore the pasuk is telling us that even though they could have been a problem, nevertheless they were not, and Yaakov comes shalom. So number one is shalom begufay. Rashi says that Yaakov was whole physically because he was healed from his limp. Das was Yaakov is given tzilei al yidechi is given at itzof und sein milchama mit tzare shaleis of amalach. The fact that Yaakov was limping was an outcome of his battle with an angel, the angel of Esav. Ashliach von Eberstein. This was, if it was a malach, the malach was fulfilling a mission from Hashem. Und wie bald das Saini, was es getan geworden zu Yankivin, meise Tam Shu durch a malach shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is moving, und das hat nicht zu tun mit dem, was wird bewahrend in der Avtacha Ushmarticha von Esav and Lavan. When Hashem promised Yaakov that I'm going to watch over you from Esav and from Lavan. But to watch over you from a malach is not necessarily included. We'll see later in the Hira that fakert. If it's coming from a malach, it means that Hashem wanted this to happen for whatever reason. So that's not included in the Ushmarticha. So therefore the pasuk tells us that despite the fact that there was a battle with Sarei Shalesav and Yaakov was limping, nevertheless he was shalom begufay. He came whole physically. The second thing Rashi says is that he was whole from monetarily, and he didn't lose anything from giving Esav such a big gift. Even after Yaakov gave Esav all of this gift, all of this money, all this value, Yaakov still remained very wealthy. As we understand from the psukim. For example, the pasuk says, we had this last week in Parshas Vayetze, Vayifrei Sa'ish Me'oid Me'oid. We actually in Sicha in Vayetze Beis, he brought in one of the orders that Me'oid Me'oid is Bli Gvul Amiti, because Me'oid means very. Very means there's no end to very. Say something is very good. Good is good. Very, very good. When you say very, very, so if Me'oid is Bli Gvul, Me'oid is Bli Gvul Amiti, which means that Vayifrei Tzeish Ma'id means that Yaakov was incredibly wealthy. So even if he gave a lot of stuff to Esav, he still must have been very financially comfortable. So even if the Eibishter had not replenished that which he had spent on the gift, it wouldn't have diminished any of the Eibishter's promise. Ushmarticha goimar it still wouldn't have diminished Hashem's promise that I'll watch over you and I won't abandon you, which would include bread to eat. In other words, Yaakov would still have enough for Shabbos, as they say. So therefore, there was no need, mitzad haftachas HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there was no need to replenish the money that he spent on the gift. Says the Pasuk of Yava Yaakov Shalom, that despite the fact that Yaakov was covered by the promise that he would have enough to live on, the Eibishter nevertheless makes him Shalom, which is that he replenishes the money that he spent on the gift. Shalom b'teirasei. Then Rashi says that he was whole in his learning Torah, that he did not forget his learning in Lavan's house. So the Rebbe is going to clarify over here that there's two reasons why Yaakov could have been affected in Lavan's house. Either because Lavan was a Rasha and his evil ways would affect Yaakov, or because Yaakov was so busy working for Lavan that he wouldn't have time to learn and to chazer his learning, to review his learning. So the Rebbe is going to clarify over here that the protection from Esav's wickedness, Lavan's wickedness, Lavan's evil, that was covered in the Eibishter's promise. But the protection from the fact that he had to work so hard, or that he did work so hard and didn't have as much time to learn, that is not covered in the Eibishter's promise, and that's why it says Vayava Yaakov Shalom. Says the Rebbe. The possibility that Yaakov would forget his learning is nicht zu lieb der Wirkung von Yaakov's Sein zusammen mit Lavan der Rasha. Is not because it's not an influence from Lavan onto Yaakov. That's not the concern, because of them had Yaakov gebeten b'shavti b'shalom. That ready Yaakov davened for this. I should arrive. I should return in peace. Shalom min hachet shle'olim b'darchei Lavan. I should be whole from sin. I should not learn from Lavan's ways. But das is mekuyim givarin, which this was fulfilled. V'Yaakov had geschickt zagen Esavin im Lavan orosh garti v'Yaakov mitzvah shamarti v'lamadati v'maisav aroim. As we have in the beginning of the parsha, the Yaakov says to Esav, I lived with Lavan all these years, and nevertheless I observed all 613 mitzvahs, and I didn't learn from his evil ways. So therefore, the chiddush that he was shalim b'teirasei is not that he didn't learn from Lavan's ways, because that was already covered by the Eibush just promised to him. Now, Yaakov is going to be based Lavan is given vernommen mit Grace Übergegebenkeit zu sein Arbeit als Reue sein, because since Yaakov was so busy, dedicated to his job as a shepherd, he's obligated to do so according to Torah, as was explained at length in the Vayetze Sicha, Vayetze Beis that we learned last week. Yaakov said, I worked with all of my strengths. I worked during the day and during the night. I couldn't sleep. When I've dem and he did 20 years like this, is verstandig dem Chiddush Hachi Gadol, as nit geguckt auf dem allem, is the Shachat Mude Beis Lavan. So there's a major Chiddush that despite all of this work, 20 years, day and night, that he was working on Lavan's sheep and Lavan's finances, that he didn't forget his learning. Der Chiddush is aber nicht verbunden mit Avtachat HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shmaticha b'chalosh Chelek, but it wasn't covered by the promise that I will watch over you wherever you go. Warum, wenn Yaakov vernimmt sich mit dem Öfen Melacha sein bebeise Beretz Canaan? Because had Yaakov did Melacha in this way at home, well, das euch danke darf der Bracha mich das nicht vergessen Talmudai. He would also need a bracha not to forget his learning. So in other words, the fact that he's bebeis Lavan, that was part of Hashem's bracha. In other words, let me repeat that. The fact that he wasn't affected by Lavan's negative influences, that was covered by Hashem's bracha, because it's part of his journey. But overworking, or working too hard and not having time to learn, that's not connected to a journey. That can happen when you're at home as well. So therefore, despite the fact that this wasn't covered by the Eibishter's promise, nevertheless comes the pasuk and says a chiddush that despite the fact that he worked for 20 years, day and night, he didn't forget his learning. So this is the pshat in Rashi. We still have to answer the first two questions of the Sikha, but overall we already see where we're going here. That Rashi is answering the question, why does the pasuk have to tell us that the Yaakov came Shalom if he already had a bracha from the Eibishter, and we know that when the Eibishter gives a bracha, the bracha is guaranteed to be fulfilled. And the answer is that these are things that wouldn't be covered by the bracha. Either by Shalom begufay, it happened through a malach, and therefore it's not part of the Ushmarticha, or because Yaakov was already wealthy, he didn't need the replenishment of that money, and therefore to go beyond that and pay him back and replenish what he lost, what he spent, is not included in the bracha, but nevertheless Yaakov Shalom. And number 3, despite the fact that he was working hard to base Lavan, which was not covered by the bracha, because working hard is not part of the journey specifically, nevertheless Yaakov Shalom, he didn't forget his learning with base Lavan. Sifei, now we're going to go back to our 2 questions. One question is, why does Rashi not bring Shalem Bebonov? And number 2, why does Rashi use base Lavan and not the fact that he didn't forget his learning, despite the fact that he was traveling, which would fit better with Psuta Shel Mikra? Now, the first 2 questions also fall away. Number 1, Rashi can bring in the meaning for Shalom Bebonov. As Esav at Nitke can't honor the Bebonov Shal Yaakov, im Yaveh Esav v'Gomer. Rashi can't bring the fact that Esav was not able to hurt the children of Yaakov, because that would be included in the Eibishter's original promise to Yaakov, and I will protect you. And the pasuk does not tell it to us because we know it from the bracha. And for the same reason, Rashi cannot say that Shalom B'Tirasei means that he didn't forget his learning, despite the fact that he was traveling. Because that also is included in Hashem's original promise. Hashem told him, I will protect you in everywhere that you will go. As the Rebbe said, that the Eibishter will protect him from any negative effect that traveling, including learning Torah, could have on him. Is going to protect me along the way that I'm traveling. Just like Hashem promised Hashem that the journey will not affect in all 3 areas of Pirya V'Rivya, of having children, of Mammon, of his finances, and of his shame, and of his name. So too by Yaakov, anything that could be negatively affected by traveling, that was covered in the Ushmaticha B'Chalesh Telech. So the fact that Yaakov didn't forget his learning, or was whole in his learning, despite the fact that he was traveling all this time, that we already know from the Eibishter's promise. So therefore Rashi says, what other area is there where we could say a chiddush that Yaakov was whole in his learning, despite the fact that he worked for 20 years, day and night? Nevertheless, the learning, the Yaakov was Shalom B'Tirasei. So the Ad Kan is the pshat of Rashi, where we understand what's bothering Rashi, why the pasuk has tells of Yaakov Shalom, and Rashi has to explain to us that it's Shalom in specific areas that were not covered by the Eibishter's promise, and Rashi explains each of them very, very beautifully. Now we come to Yein Shal Teira and Pirush Rashi, the wine of Teira, the deeper and the practical lesson to us. What gerät as the Alicha von Yaakov in Kecharon is Meramis of Alichas Bonov, Bnei Yisrael, Umais Avis and Labanim and Galus. It has been discussed specifically just last week in Parashas Vayetze Sicha Beis, but in many other sichos as well, that Yaakov going to Charan represents or reflects the journey of the Yidden going down into Galus. Ma'isa Avisim and Labanim, the Rebbe said in the Vayetze Sicha, that it's not just a siman, but it's also an asinas koyach. And we also it's also a something to learn from. It's not just because it happened here, but we learn from it. The pasuk says that Yaakov arrives. So in the beginning of Vayetze, Yaakov left. Yaakov went to Charan, which represents the going into Galus. Now the pasuk says that Yaakov Avinu comes whole to the city of Shechem, that is in the land of Canaan, coming from Padan Aram. The Rebbe says, "Maftiach Yader Eden," as if it's umkehren Shalom ganzer from Galus. The Rebbe is making a promise that every Yid is going to return whole from Galus, despite the fact that Galus has terrible trials and tribulations. As we'll see, nevertheless, a Yid is promised by the Eibishter that he's going to be returned whole. When Rashi Mavayro Meisif, and Rashi explains, "Ados was love and base of Kenem Mitzadat when it angry na Eden. Uner Yaakov kumt at Shalom Kenet Yisrael." The fact that the loved ones and the Esavs of Galus cannot hurt a Jew, and a Yid comes back Shalom, dead in Yin is a milsa de pshita. Nitos is there ufta from Yaakov Shalom. That's obvious. Avdem or the Eibishter melchatchila maftiach ben achedim is up in Galus. The Eibishter made a promise before we went down to Galus. I am with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go. And nobody has the strength, nobody has the ability to hurt a Jewish person in Galus. That is a given. The Chiddush is this pasuk that the Eibush is telling us that nobody will be harmed in Galus is a Chiddush is as follows. As a feel in the Inyanim Lechedim, it's Adam say the Visisush Geshelt Milamayla. Is Faran on earth as Galus or Pales on Achisaron and Eden, even in those areas that as it was established from above, there is a possibility that there should be a negative effect on a Yid. Because and there actually a chisaron, a lack, a void occurs. Like by Yaakov, where he had to give away some of his money, or he was hurt in his hip. Zog der pasuk Yaakov Shalom. So even those things that milamaila create or seem to create a chisaron, says the pasuk that Yaakov comes back whole. As the chisaron is nitkin emes, the chisaron isn't real. Says blaze and in Yelefisha it is temporary. Aber sof. There chisaron batul and Yaakov Shalom. This lack. It comes to an end, and Yaakov returns whole. That a Yid that goes into Galus, even those things where there is a sense of something is lacking, and it's something that it seems that it's supposed to be that way, that's only during Galus temporarily. But when a Yid comes back from Galus, everything is returned back to its place, and the Yid comes back whole. And these are three things that could happen in Galus that Rashi is talking about. Number one, Shalim Begufish and Mezalose. The first thing Rashi says is Yaakov was whole physically, he was healed from his limp. Einer from the Elohim and the Aveda from Zman HaGalus is the Aveda of Mesiris Nefesh. One of the tasks, one of the things we have to accomplish in Galus is Mesiris Nefesh. This is why there is suffering in Galus. It's a test. As the pasuk says, the Eibishter is testing you to draw out of the Yid the idea of Mesiris Nefesh. This is what happens more on a more spiritual level when the angel of Esav hurts the hip of Yaakov. Noga b'chol tzadikim shasidin liyis mimenu. The Medrash says that this pain that the Esav, that the Sari shel Esav gave to Yaakov was actually affecting all of the later generations. Then Ramban explains Zed Deirish shel Shmad. This is referring to those generations that were threatened with having to give up their life for being Jewish. The story of Yaakov being hit by the Malach is a remez, is an allusion to the sufferings, to the worst possible sufferings of Galus. And these challenges, these sufferings, is to awaken by a Yid Mesiris Nefesh. In other words, there's a sense here is that certain things that happen, certain challenges or struggles that happen in Galus are actually part of a process to awaken within a Yid Mesiris Nefesh. Since we see that the suffering is coming not from Esav down below, the actual nations of the world that are trying to hurt us, but they actually originate from Sarei Shel Esav. They come from above to awaken within the Yid Mesiris Nefesh. One can think that it's something real and it's something that's permanent. That even Yaakov was healed from his limp. That once we complete the Aveda of Galus, wherein the Yisurim in ganzen bottle, all of the suffering ends, is healed from his limp and he becomes whole again. In other words, a person could say, maybe the suffering in Galus, because it's ordained by Hashem, it comes through a malach, maybe it's something that remains forever. Says Rashi, says the pasuk Shalom. Rashi says Shalom begufay that it was only temporary, and once we complete the Aveda of Galus, there will be a total healing. There will be no more suffering, no more pain. The second thing was that he was complete financially. What is the lesson of that? Says the Rebbe as follows: The tachlis von Golus is nicht nur as Ida is allein zal der von Eris kommen ganz v'shalom. The purpose of Golus is not just so the Yid himself should come out whole and complete, nor as soll euch übermachen die Jahren von Golus und sie machen amoinoi mahapach sein der Kedusha. It's also that to transform Golus, his money, it should be transformed into holiness. Al derech v'Yaakov is nicht nur allein nitzel geworden von Lavan v'Esav, hat mitgenommen von Lavan a ribui otzum. Just like by Yaakov, not only his life was saved, but he took an incredible abundance from Yaakov, from Lavan, which Lavan said, everything that you see is mine. It all was in the possession of Lavan. Spiritually speaking, it was all in the possession of the forces of evil. And Yaakov took it from him and brought it to Eretz Yisrael. Al derech zeh, uftan the Yishapchus in Esav and Gufa. Similarly, Yaakov also accomplished a transformation in Esav. As Murazevas Esav dem gewalt argenen, that in place of the fact that Esav wanted to kill him, is vayoretz Esav a gamer v'yichabkeo, gamer v'yishakeo. Esav ran over to him and he hugged him and he kissed him. Bizal das Rashbi is as given b'chal libay. According to Rashbi, we had a sikha on this last year, that Rashbi holds that this hugging and kissing from Esav to Yaakov was sincere, was authentic. Even though there is a known fact that is even entrenched in halacha, that Esav hates Yaakov, and that continues today. In that moment, according to Rashbi, it was he hugged him and kissed him wholeheartedly, which is a total transformation of what Esav represents to what happens in that moment. So the purpose of Galus is to transform the Galus, to take from Lavan and his money and elevate it to Kedusha, to take from Esav and to transform him. In the brackets, the Rebbe adds that this avodah of transforming Esav is a preparation to the time of Mashiach, where it says that those who are bringing this salvation will go up to Har Tzion to judge Har Esav, and adds that Hashem will be the king. Not only will we judge Esav or punish Esav, the Esav will recognize that the Eibishter is king. That when Mashiach comes, he's going to rectify the world, the entire world, that everyone should serve Hashem. Then I will transform the nations, that they should all call out in the name of Hashem. So in Galus, we're transforming Esav as a achana to the ultimate transformation, which happens when Mashiach comes. And how did Yaakov transform Esav? With a derin, with a gift. In addition to davening, Yaakov actually sent him a gift. Al derech zeh is b'yeder Eden, so too by every single Yid. As gedetz mevarim hapech an kedusha dinyanim from Welt Esav b'frat from Galus. When you want to transform and refine the worldly matters, the Esav matters especially in Galus. After davening, what you have to do is you have to use your own money in order to begin this transformation. Just like a present. Git von sein Zman auf Chedesh, Zereya. Person has to give his time to akeren. Chedesh, to plow. Zereya, to plant. Belachtecha, shartasa, whatever it is, the work that you do. Which that time should have been used for learning. And instead, you have to go out into the world and work the world. When Zerti Shalateda Mateyala. Zum Mavaras an die Welt Esav. Das heißt, lasst sich herab in Welt und vernimmt sich mit den Jahren im Gash mit Chirisha v'chulu. Lasst du sich anton in Levusha yam is better. Geht zu kennen Peilen auf Welt. Here he's going out into the world to involve himself in physical matters, so much so that he is vested in the garments of that which he is trying to transform. He's going mamish into the world in order to affect the world. Thereby converting the shaila. Vibal di aveda is nit in an efen von nisayin, was it nit kemetzias hamitis, not an initial period of This is not a suffering of the world, which, as we said in the previous if, is not real, it's temporary. This is actually, you're changing the world. Af ibermachen welt, you're transforming the world, but das is ametzias hamitis, which is a real thing. You're actually turning the world into something holy. Das heißt, die Rede von seiner Keches aus Mani in Gashmis Ha'olam is chas v'shalom adavar shel chayama. He's going down, he has to actually invest his time and his money into the world in order to make this transformation. If a person sits in the yeshiva all day and learns, then it's a beautiful thing, but it won't change the world. So in short, we were explaining Shalom b'mamoinai, and the Rebbe says the whole purpose of Galus is not just that the Yid comes out whole, but that the world is transformed. In order to transform the world, he has to go into the world and he has to involve himself in the world. And the question is, what about all of his own money and everything that he invested into this world in order to change the world? So comes the pasuk and says, even the loss of financial matters or time is also temporary. A Yid will become and remain whole, even financially. As we go to the Geula, we're going to take along all of our physical wealth, our physical possessions, material possessions, in a way that everything is whole, it is elevated into holiness. So Rashi is telling us in the Yenishal Torah that despite the fact that a Yid goes down into Golus, and Golus has terrible challenges, so number one, anything that has to do with the Goyim, with the loved ones and the Esavs, that they shouldn't be able to harm a Yid, that is not even a concern. That we were promised before we went out into Golus, that Hashem is protecting us. What about certain individual things that do seem to be a challenge in Golus? For example, the fact that there's suffering in Golus for the purpose of Mesiras Nefesh. Says Yaakov Shalom, when we end Golus, that is restored. There'll be no more suffering, no more pain. And what about all of the time and the money that gets invested into changing the world, into transforming the world? Says the pasuk Yaakov Shalom, that too a Yid is going to take with him when he goes out of Golus and is going to be able to elevate it to Kedusha. And finally, Rashi says Shalom b'teirasei. So that the person, that the Yaakov did not forget his learning in the Beis Lavan. The Inyan von Talmud Torah b'shleimusei fadet aprishus from Welt. Normally, in order to learn Torah properly, you have to remove yourself from the world. Isolate yourself. As we find by Yaakov himself, that first he was a Yeshiv Yolim, he sat in the tents of learning, and even after he left, he was nitman, he was immersed in the Beis Medrash of Ever for 14 years. Tayin tayin, wie bald mein Mund von ihm zu vernehmen sich mit die Berührung von Galus und Mokum Galus. Ist doch nicht scheich, soll sie anhalten, was Meister sein Dargeneilis in Teire. Since you're demanding of me that I should get involved in the Berührung of Galus, it's not possible that he should hold on to his lofty level in Torah. A person is in yeshiva, he learns, he reaches a certain level. Now you tell him, go out into the world and change the world. What's going to happen to my Torah? We tell him that Yaakov did not forget his learning with Beis Lavan. By the previous two things, there is a lack, there's suffering, there's pain in Golus, and there's an investment of time and of money. There is something missing, but when Golus finishes, it will be replenished, it will be completed. But when it comes to learning, there's no lack, there's nothing missing. As the Frierdiker Rebbe said, only our physical bodies were handed over into the galus and the enslavement to the other kingdoms. Our souls were never expelled into galus, and were never given over to the control of the other nations. Is the kavane in them? What does this mean? That only our gufim are in galus? Kipastus is kavane in them. Nicht nur kipastus loschen in the movement from galus kipshute as malchis haben it kishlita von neshama. Doesn't just mean that the other kingdoms have no control over our neshama. nor nochmer, as the echt the avede mit galus rüht nit on the pnimi is an neshama sache von galus. That even when you work in the galus environment, it does not affect the essence of the neshama. The yiride from the modem in galus zum avares and dinyana galus is blazed negate the chesenes neshama. It can only affect the external elements of the neshama. Aber in the neshama atzma, welche is in galus nit vertrieben, is in teichen yiride chas v'shalom. The neshama, the way it relates to the guf, it comes down into galus. It's not affected by galus, but it's not affected, meaning to say it's still a neshama. But at least, but there might be some effect. But the etzem neshama, it has no yirida. Nothing happens. Nothing is affected to the neshama just because of galus. When the Rabbi Vayishlach Talmud beis Lavan, the Teira was Yaakov gelernt sein, the Knitten mit Precious von Welt, so we geblieben ganz echt beis Lavan. And therefore Yaakov doesn't forget his learning. All that Teira that he learned when he was isolated in the yeshiva of Aver, it remains whole. Jeder Idat hat in der Sinneskirche von Yankovin. Soll nicht nur sein Shalom, a reiskindig von Galus. And this is my Savas Labanim. This is the lesson, this is the takeaway for Yaakov's children. That every Yid has the ability, has a strength. Not only is he Shalom when he goes out of Galus, even while he is in Galus, in Lavan's house, can resign in a darge von Shachach Talmudei. He's in this level that he doesn't forget his learning, that the spiritual parts of him remain complete, remain whole. He is whole in his Torah. So the Yena Solteira is teaching us that even the suffering of Galus and even the loss of time and money in Galus will be replaced when Mashiach comes. But more than that, even while we're in Galus, the Ruchnius of a Yid, the Torah of a Yid, remains unaffected. You could be bebeis Lavan, working day and night, trying to transform the world and elevate the world and all the other things that we do in this world to make a dina b'tachtenim, and the Torah of a Yid and the Ruchnius of a Yid does not have to be affected by that. And that's the Vayav Yaakov Shalom, begufay, b'mamoinay, u'b'tirasay.